European disunion, which I'm told there are no copies here except that one, but you can get it on Amazon. And next to me is Stefan Bredel, who's the Deputy Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany, but you were also head of the EU Internal Politics Division in the German Foreign Office before that. You held a variety of jobs in Brussels as well. And then joining us via Zoom, I see our old friend and FCC member, Thomas Noki, who's he's the head of the EU office here in Hong Kong, and he's been here since 2020, September of 2020, but he's got long experience in Asia and South Korea, Australia, the Pacific. He was head in Pakistan and Afghanistan as well before that. And he's joining us from, looks like an extended stay on his vacation or his trip back from Europe, and he's going to be joining us. Can you hear it all, Thomas, there? Hopefully we can get he doesn't seem to be hearing us well, so hopefully we can get the sound coming up there, so Thomas Noki will be able to join us there. I think we can see your lips moving, Thomas. We'll get that sorted out in just a moment there. So hopefully we'll be able to, hopefully you'll be able to join the conversation in just a few minutes. But I did want to start. Let's go ahead and get started where we're sorting out the sound on there. Just give me the thumbs up when you've got him okay and ready to join us. They're working on that. But in the meantime, Stefan Auer, I wanted to start with you because you are actually the genesis of this panel, because you've got this fascinating new book out called European Disunion. And it's looking at, you were looking at all the problems within the European Union forming a united bloc, including what you talked about as the democratic deficit, among other things. But you wrote most of the book before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which saw the European Union kind of come together like never before. So I guess talk a little bit about your book and whether, given what we see now with the unity in the EU, would you still use the title European Disunion?
Thanks. So this is the book, and the cover is actually, blue and yellow, which is an allusion to the EU, because as you said, I finished writing it very much before the invasion, but I'm very pleased with the added meaning that the cover has now. And I was fortunate enough actually to be able to write a short kind of afterward author's note after the actual invasion. And I took the opportunity to reflect on the question of unity and whether the title is still appropriate, because indeed it seemed, particularly in the early stages of the war, that the EU was united in its opposition towards Russia. But my proposition in this short kind of introductory talk is that the title, unfortunately, is still relevant, and we are seeing a growing division within the EU, even in relation to Russia. So my starting proposition is that the EU is not fit for its purpose, because nobody quite knows. The EU is not fit for purpose because nobody quite knows what its purpose is. That is at the heart of its problem. In relation to Ukraine and Russia, the EU was strong enough to motivate Ukrainians repeatedly in their fight for freedom and independence. Now, I'm also talking about 2014, right? The Maidan movement that resulted in the toppling of a corrupt regime and the assertion, a very strong assertion of Ukrainian independence. So the EU was strong enough to motivate Ukrainians in their fight for freedom and independence, but not strong enough to protect them against an aggressive and revanchist Russia. Right? Now, defenders of the EU would tell me that that was never its task, right? But I would say in response, well, if that's not its task, why is Borrell, Joseph Borrell, you heard of him, right? Promising Ukrainians as early as March this year that the EU will provide Ukraine with weapons, including fighter jets, right? A day after that promise was made, he had to unmake it. He was in no position to make a promise like that, right? More recently, the same Joseph Borrell, in response to Putin's threats of nuclear escalation, promised that the Russian army would be annihilated if Putin was foolish enough to resort to nuclear weapons. Again, who is Joseph Borrell to make such a promise? He has no army to accomplish that task. He's not even a foreign minister, right? He's often referred to as the EU's foreign minister, but he's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security, because the EU is not a state. So it has no foreign minister, it has no government, it certainly has no army. It is in between, right? That's the textbook wisdom about the EU, which I discuss at length in the book. And that in-betweenness has worked for Europeans very well for decades, right? Prior to the immense challenges that Europe has faced in its crisis decade, right? That was even before the war started. But the main argument of my book is that in times of crisis, the EU hasn't worked, it hasn't lived up to its many promises, and it has in fact eroded democracy in Europe, which is one of my main preoccupations. So in response, I can tell you, I'll be told that the EU embraces crisis, and time and again, Europeans got together. Crisis in the process of European integration always represented an opportunity, right? I attended a similar panel just a week ago where a distinguished participant from EU Consul General, one of your colleagues, instructed me that even the war in Ukraine represents a tremendous opportunity for Europeans to advance with green energy transition, right? Because for once, the Europeans are truly forced to decarbonize their economies. Well, apart from the moral absurdity of that claim, right, it kind of relegates that horrible war into the kind of background music for EU's energy transition. It's factually, actually, completely incorrect, right? Like, look at what Europeans are doing. Germans were proudly the leaders of energy transition worldwide, and they have now not fulfilled the task they set themselves to achieve in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions. What's more, their policy towards that energy transition actively strengthened basically the dependence on Russia and massively increased Russian capabilities to wage the war that Ukrainians now suffer under. And that, to me, is one of many examples that I could list and try to list in the book. I talk about Germany, but Germans also managed to kind of export that policy preference to the EU level. So it's one of the many examples where the EU doesn't know what it's doing, right? It is drawn into different directions. And the main problem that occurs in relation to kind of democratic legitimacy that you touched on is that there is a massive capabilities and expectations gap, right? So people like Borrell, the quasi-foreign minister, promises things he can't deliver, but the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen does the same, right? By promising that the EU will be a major geopolitical actor, which it is now in position of doing. And yet, just one more example of the EU's dysfunction. So the EU is not a state, it doesn't have a government, it has a system of governance. Like Ursula von der Leyen is not the EU's prime minister, but the Commission President. The EU has competencies, but it does not always use its competencies wisely. So I applaud the EU for having got together and imposed sanctions on Russia, as the entire Western world did. But look at what's happening now, more recently, right? As the EU and Germany in particular are struggling to adjust to this massive challenge of energy, weaning itself out of energy dependency on Russia. And as the EU is completely dependent on the US as its security umbrella, the EU seeks, as the EU is facing a very real war in its eastern neighborhood, the EU seeks a trade war with the one and only country that can protect it against aggressive Russia, and that is the United States. And it's completely insane. The trade war is on an issue that the EU has pursued for decades as its main kind of agenda, right? Again, I'm talking about the environmental protection and the CO2 emissions. So Biden, for once, unexpectedly, manages to push forward a legislation that doesn't have bipartisan support in the US in favor of energy transition. He does it in a mercantilist way, in a protectionist way, that does seem to be in contradiction to an ideal world of liberal internationalism, etc., that Europeans also support. But, you know, once again, we see Europeans drawn into different directions and pursuing contradictory goals that cannot all be achieved at the same time. So the new commission led by Ursula von der Leyen, prior to any of this happened, Russia, etc., when it was inaugurated in 2019, promised that the EU would have a more geopolitical commission, a commission that is aware of its power and its responsibility in the wider world. Josep Borrell repeatedly reinstated the same aim. From where I stand, the EU has not delivered on its many promises, and that is a major liability for democracy in Europe. That's probably enough.
Excellent. Thank you. Thomas Noki, can you hear us? Okay. Thomas, can you hear us? I'm not sure Thomas Noki is. Can you hear us, Thomas? Maybe you can. Thomas, can you hear Thomas Noki? Can you hear us on the Zoom? Okay, we're going to try to get him back so you can hear us in Zoom in a moment. I heard Germany's name mentioned a few times in there, so maybe you'd want to have a comment here, Stefan, in the room before we go to Thomas. What do you think of that analysis about both the EU being not fit for purpose and not knowing what they're doing, and also the comments you heard about Germany?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Well, what can how can I answer this? These kind of thesis you have just mentioned. I mean, we have to differentiate a little bit. Some of these sentences you said are mere facts. Of course, the EU is not a nation state. It's no problem with that. Nobody has ever said that. We are not fit for purpose, or we don't keep our promises. Well, we are 27 member states who are bound together by treaties. And these treaties stipulate quite clearly what role and function each institution, organization, and so on has. And there is nobody said that Josep Borrell would be a foreign minister. So of course this is not well. I don't see it as a problem, because his role is defined by the treaty. But whereas, for example, the EU and the member states, we all know that the EU is responsible for the common trade policy. This is done by the Commission, and the member states have agreed that trade policy is dealt with by the European Commission. So many of the things I heard and you were mentioning, I was just asking myself, well, yeah, but obvious. So having been in Brussels for some years, having worked with European affairs, all these things are well known. And as a European, I have to admit, as long as I grew up and I follow political debates, so for more than 40 years now, I know that all this is difficult, and never in decades it has been easy for us Germans to negotiate industrial or agricultural policy with France. I have colleagues who still remember the time when the European Union was very small, 6 member states. They were able to meet in Brussels or Luxembourg, sitting close to a fireside, and then they were able to solve European problems in the course of one night. Just they had one piece of paper and 6 persons just sitting there. And even at that time, Germany and France traditionally come from absolutely opposed positions. So that is our, well, historic knowledge. That is how things are dealt with in Europe. And you all know, of course, the history of wars and so on. Europeans wanted to make an end to that, and this is complicated. So this is one part of the things. And the other part is what is happening today. I was also quite happy to see unity or no unity after the invasion of Ukraine, because at a field where European Union normally does not have many competences, and this is foreign policy, the EU has until now proven quite united. Of course, different member states, I just try to figure out, for example, how much help or aid is given to Ukraine, do this to a different extent. From Poland and the Baltic states, there is more aid than from Germany or from Spain or Portugal, for example. But that's also natural because, well, we are much closer to Ukraine. Also, as far as the migrants are concerned, there are many more migrants coming to our countries than to some other countries. But I wouldn't really say that giving all this history and all the, well, the different history these member states have, that this is really a sign of disunity. And now following debates, for example, in the United States and other countries, who knows what will come out and how will things develop there in the coming months. I think this is very normal for a democratic process. I think this is very normal for a debate between different organizations and institutions. We always have to figure out and to make a compromise. And well, as far as I remember, we have always been able to do so with difficulties. And of course, you can have put many question marks on many decisions. But for the time being, I'm quite, well, convinced that the majority is still with us. Let me give one example. There have been the first regional elections in Germany in the month of October in a quite huge German region, Lower Saxonia. And we already had half a year of debate about Ukraine, people in favor of military support, against it. People are afraid of energy crisis, and so on and so on. And one could have assumed that the outcome of this election would already give a hint how things are developing. And it was quite normal. It was quite normal. Of course, between these, parties like Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, things are moving, but it was not as dramatic as somebody could have foreseen. So at the end of the day, I would say much of the criticism I cannot really understand and not sign up with. Thanks.
Thank you. Thomas Noki, can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Can
you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now. Thank you very much for joining us. Sorry you couldn't be here in person, but I wanted you as the head of the EU office to respond to some of what Stefan Auer was saying earlier.
Yes.
He mentioned that you're not fit for purpose, and that the EU is racked by dysfunction. And well, you've heard, I hope you heard some of the criticisms about how the EU basically is not up to this challenge. What would you say?
Okay, thank you, Keith. And I'm sorry about the problems I had in connecting with your team. We managed to sort those out. I don't know what was the problem. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. This is really a case of no free lunch. But I'm happy to be able to connect. And I unfortunately I didn't hear, or fortunately I should say, from the sounds of it, I didn't hear the first presentation.
Could I just summarize in one sentence?
Yeah.
Could I just say the opening proposition is very simple, and you kind of summarize it, but only half of it. The EU is not fit for purpose because nobody quite knows what its purpose is. That was my proposition.
Okay, I'll try and respond to that. But I caught part of Stefan's intervention, and I think what I'm going to say goes along those lines. And it's obviously I just returned from Europe, And obviously the crisis in Ukraine, the unprovoked and unjustified aggression is really on everyone's mind, as is the energy crisis that is resulting from this. So I think that's the first thing to note, and I think Stefan alluded to that, the fact that we've had so far a very high degree of unity on the response, whether it's in terms of supporting Ukraine or whether it's in terms of the measures taken in the field of energy to tackle the energy crisis. Now, a lot of this is work in progress. This is happening at the moment. I'm not undermining understating the challenges. I'm just saying that this is, so far, there's a sense of purpose to work on this together. And I think that's part of the answer to Stefan. When you see the response to what's happening in Ukraine, whether it's the eight rounds of sanctions, whether it's the provision for the first time in the European Union's history of military equipment, over 3 billion euros, whether it's putting together a military assistance mission for Ukraine, not to speak of the huge sums of macro financial assistance that's been given to the country. And here we have a total support of 22 billion euros this year. These are huge amounts, which if there wasn't unity or sense of purpose, I don't think we could mobilize such huge amounts. But the first 3 points I mentioned, in other words, sanctions, the use of the sending of military equipment on behalf of the EU, and the military training missions, these are all decisions which require unanimity. They are things which, because of our, and this could be criticized, it means we're slower to act, but these require the unanimous approval of all member states. And so it's, I think we've achieved quite a lot in terms so far in that regard. A little bit in terms of the energy crisis. We were highly dependent on Russian oil and gas, too dependent. 40% of our gas came from Russia. Now it's more like 7 and 8%. And we are taking common decisions. There's an emergency regulation that is going to come into force in December, which aims at addressing the energy crisis. This is something decided by the EU, and which will tackle through joint purchasing, through caps on revenues of electricity producers, solidarity contributions, so fossil fuel companies that are making huge revenues, and this is all being decided at European level. So, and I think citizens are seeing this. So to say that the EU is not fit for purpose and racked by dysfunction when we are taking these major decisions in the face of a huge crisis that's affecting Europe, I think is really this doesn't stand. Just to then you might say, okay, this is what governments are doing, but what do citizens feel? Which is also important, and which ultimately affects policy and the work of governments. And here I turn to something we call the Eurobarometer survey, which is a survey that the European Commission has been running since 1973. And first of all, in terms of the image of the EU, you have 47% of respondents, of EU citizens, who feel that there's a positive image of the EU, with 36 who are neutral. And then when it comes to the war in Ukraine, here you have a total of 57%, which are happy with or satisfied with what is being done at EU level. Even when it comes to the less, I would say, more controversial decision of sending weapons, here you have 68% of respondents who tend to agree or totally agree. Now, these are important numbers in terms of that are coming out through the survey. Maybe I'll finish by saying that despite these crises, and we went through first of all COVID, like the rest of the world did, but that was the first crisis in 2020-21, and now we are confronted with another crisis of a different type. But still, the EU is getting on with its business, and there are things which are done at EU level. And just to quote the two main priorities of the current Commission, which are climate change, and where you have the Sharm el-Sheikh COP going on at the moment. This is high on the agenda of the EU. We have everything that's happening in terms of digital transformation as well. This is another big priority, which the work continues there. And a very specific example, which I'll end on, is the fact that that probably not many people, I haven't seen this in the news in Hong Kong, and many people aren't aware, but in less than 2 months, Croatia will join the Euro. So the Eurozone is actually being expanded and will now count 20 members within the Eurozone. So just to say that, yes, there are these crises which are affecting the work of the EU, but to a large extent, the business continues while we are trying to address these crises. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I apologize again for not being there in person.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Consul General Alexander Danda, you're a frontline state, Poland, and so you are in a good position to assess whether the EU has risen to the occasion, is fit for purpose, or can more be done. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Keith, for this opportunity to being in here and to discuss this very timely issue from the perspective of, like you said, the frontline states, from the perspective of the fifth largest state in the EU, the state which, geopolitically speaking, has changed a lot in the last couple of months, not only years, but even months. From the state which was linking the East and West, yes, under very difficult conditions of our troubled relations with Russia and with Belarus. We were trying to be that kind of bridge, and now we are, like you said, the frontline state. So the rationale for all the decisions taken by our government has changed dramatically. Also within the EU, but I would like to address maybe the question which has been put as the main question at the beginning of our discussion today by Stefan here. I would like to address it by asking the question: what is unity? What is unity? Is unity something like one voice and no dissent at all, or unity might be described as the willingness to discuss differences in order to get to the compromise, yes, more alongside what Habermas has been writing, yes. So if we think about those two notions of unity, then European Union is not the unity in the first sense of the word. We know of some other political constructs which serve that part of unity definition, yes. We do not have to look further along the field. European Union is more like the second part of proposal for the definition. Yes, the definition to listen, the definition which accentuates the willingness to listen and to get to the compromise, which might not be like the ideal for everybody, but which in the end will get the approval of all the interested parties. So as far as Poland is concerned, we are thinking about the EU in that kind of way. Yes, the place where we will be listened to, and the place where we will have to listen to others and to try to come to some sort of middle ground in order to have a common say in the international relations scene. So of course, in Poland, we do understand that as a middle-sized country in Europe, we do not play a big part in international relations on the global scale, but as a part of the EU, we can and we are playing this role. So that is why in Poland, the EU membership is very, very highly valued. So you probably could have heard about, I'm sure you've heard about the struggles which the Polish government has got of late with the European Union concerning the rule of law, concerning different issues connected with the migration crisis that we used to have in 2015, and now we are experiencing the migration crisis ourselves. Whereas from the country of 38 million, we became a country of 40 million people with 2 million Ukrainian refugees in our border only in the matter of a couple of weeks after February the 24th. So we do have those testing environment with the EU, but that does not mean that we are not loyal to the idea of the European Union. I would say that the EU, we're discussing that before coming to this room. So in Poland, the EU is being thought more like a family of independent states. Like in every family, we have got good times, we have got bad times, but at the end of the day, it is important that we can sit around the table and have a meal together and say that, okay, there are some issues which divide us, but in the end, we are in it together, and this is what it counts. So if I were to answer what is the purpose of the EU, it is this possibility of discussing our differences and coming to some envisaged common ground in here. But I would also like to say a few words about this unity, the newfound unity in the face of the Ukrainian crisis. Well, I would say it's not a Ukrainian crisis. It's the Russian unprovoked brutal aggression war in Ukraine. This is actually the fulfillment of the vision for pan-Europe, something which Richard Kudenov, the Kalergi, has been writing about. It was his idea to create the United States of Europe, and as the rationale for that, he gave exactly the Russian threat. So this is something of a recurring element, that Russia is being this unifying factor for the Europe, behind the factor which causes us to rethink our differences and to stand together. Just to remind, the European Union is not the first and only project of European unity which has been attempted throughout the years. So I've mentioned the Kudenov-Kalergi, the idea of pan-Europe, which was mostly a theoretical project. But back before that, we had the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was, some would say, neither holy nor Roman. There were different attempts of unifying Europe under this umbrella between the 10th and 19th centuries. Then again, we had the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between the 16th and 18th centuries, and the idea of Mittel Europa in the 19th century. So all of those ideas, they had one common thing, which is that no European unity project excluded Central Europe from the equation. So ignoring Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, I would say is kind of a recipe for ending the project. I would like to be quite clear how Poland sees the whole idea of Pole exit, which has been flouted around just after Brexit happened. We were told by the Western media that we are the next in line. So let me quote some of the recent statistics from the public opinion research. Polish society is the most pro-European of all the societies of the member states. 82% of Poles in February, questioned in February, so it was before the war in Ukraine happened, 82% are strongly or well, are supportive in the European Union, whereas for example, the French are only 56% in favor of the EU. So there you've got the answer to the question whether Pole exit can happen easily or not. In my opinion, right now, this huge support from the Polish society, which has been unwavering actually for a number of years, is the strong safeguard before any such an attempt, which could have been thought about by any government in power. So right now, I would say that that issue of Pole exit is out of the question, definitely. And well, that does not mean that EU linking the recovery fund with the rule of law discussion is not going to dent Polish support for the European Union. That effect is, or at least might be still ahead. This 82%, or maybe let me quote the July figure for the support for the EU in Poland, it is 92%. So it already like clocks in the Russian war in Ukraine into its effect. So this 92% of support for the EU is the effect of fear of being alone in the face of Russian aggression, I would say. But if we hear from the EU continuously that we know nothing, that we should sit quiet, that we lost the chance to keep quiet. That's the quote from Jacques Chirac from the times of the Iraq War. Patronizing, it might eventually do the trick and bring Polish resentment for the European institutions below that threshold of 50%. So for now, we are in the safe ground, but I would say that this might be an issue in the future if we only have to sit and listen, and we are not listened to.
Stefan Auer, you heard a lot of people disagreeing with your thesis. What would you say?
I should be upfront with you. If you are wondering about my accent, where it comes from this region. I'm from Slovakia, originally, from Czechoslovakia. But I have lived for a long time now in the Anglosphere, and I understand that in a polite kind of conversation, this kind of setting, you start with a compliment. So I should say how much I agree with all the speakers who spoke before me, and applaud you for all the good points you made about the EU. But I think it will be more interesting for me to focus on the points of disagreements, and that's what I will do. But I do want to say that I also support the EU. I just have issues with the EU that we currently have. But of course, something like the EU is absolutely necessary for Europe and the wider world. So the conclusion to my remarks that I didn't present is to say that the EU should do less, but better, right? It shouldn't overpromise and underdeliver. And so I will just go kind of backwards and first address one of the points of disagreements with Ambassador Duda, then I'll go and address some of the disagreements with the EU ambassador, and then I move to Stefan. So starting with this, I'm thrilled that you mentioned Jürgen Habermas, because I discuss him quite extensively in my book, and I have always admired like a great public intellectual, German philosopher, sociologist. He is completely wrong on Europe in an interesting way, so it's worth engaging with. But what you say is accurate, that the EU can be imagined as a kind of ongoing conversation, providing institutional mechanisms for 27 independent nation states to come together and to generate common solutions. And that has worked remarkably well in good times. In bad times, it's a disaster. It's a real serious problem, right? The idea that you can accomplish peace through conversation is the idea that led us to the disaster that Ukrainians now suffer under, right? And there is a brilliant article criticizing Habermasian approach to international politics called Peace Through Conversation by David Martin Jones. It was published 15 years ago, and it's more current actually than ever. So in bad times, that approach doesn't work because you need someone to make a decision. There is no time for ongoing conversation when people are dying in Ukraine. Kiev is surrounded and it's about to fall, right? It was your prime minister, actually, Morawiecki, who said that if Ukraine depended on the EU at the beginning of this year, it would no longer exist, right? It was the US, the UK, and Poland as a nation state rather than the EU that saved Ukraine early on. And I remind you of the first visit of prime ministers from Europe to Kiev at the time when Kiev was surrounded, right? And while Germans and French still believed that they should negotiate with Putin, peace through conversation, you had this bold visit organized by your prime minister, your president, right? Accompanied by the Czech prime minister, by the Slovenian prime minister, at the time when we didn't know whether Kiev would stand, right? So that kind of EU, if Ukraine only could rely on that kind of EU, it will no longer exist. And this is not a trivial a kind of observation. Of course, you are absolutely right. The EU is constrained by its treaties, etc. Borrell doesn't seem to understand these treaties, making these outlandish remarks, and he's your boss, so you are not going to criticize him. But it is factually correct that the EU is constrained by these treaties. But the problem is, and that is where I applaud more awareness of the geopolitical power that Europe has. The problem is that the EU seemed unaware of its power, right? And that Ukraine is the result of it. It found itself in that gray zone. To my students, every year I presented one picture. Now there is another one added to it from 2014, and students in Hong Kong can relate to the Ukrainian fight for independence for reasons that I'm not going to discuss here. But you know what I'm talking about. So in 2014, there is a beautiful picture of the Maidan square, right? You remember the upheavals, right? It was not a bloody revolution, but there were some casualties, of course. So I have a beautiful picture published on the BBC website with this square with smoke. There was some fighting there of sorts. In the middle of it is the EU flag. And I asked my students, what does that flag do there, right? Ukrainians knew in 2014 that they were not becoming members of the EU the day after, right? The flag stood for Ukrainian ambition to be a free, democratic, well-governed country and a part of Europe, right? Now, juxtapose this picture with a gathering in Verkhovna Rada, right? The Ukrainian parliament, where your president spoke as the first foreign visitor, right? To passionate applause. Day or two before the invasion, the members of Ukrainian parliament gather in front of Verkhovna Rada, right? And displayed flags. There was no German flag there, no French flag there, and no EU flag there. There was Polish flag, the Czech flag, the UK flag, the Canadian flag, the US flag. Because Ukrainians knew by then that the EU will not save them, right? Against that bloody aggression. And I side with you. It's absolutely correct. A lot of it is tedious stuff, and I have to cover it in my book, and I do. It's treaties that constrain Europe. But it's not me who said that, you know, Ukraine is a part of Europe and then let Ukrainians to deal with Russia the best they can. It's the EU leaders, right? So that tension, that gap between ambition and capability is of the EU's making, and it has catastrophic consequences for a country like Ukraine. The ideal of interdependence worked marvelously well, and the ideal of peace through conversation worked marvelously well within the EU. So I don't want to understate that aspect of the EU as a peace project. To have France and Germany reconciled, that's great news. Germany and Poland reconciled with difficulties, great news. The folly was that the Europeans convinced themselves that they can export the same model outside of Europe. And Ukraine is the most palpable, most visible victim of that misjudgment, because it was peace through conversation that was applied to aggressive Russia even after the invasion of Crimea. A massive misjudgment that is owing to this profoundly misguided understanding of the political of politics. And that takes me just to one point I want to make about the intervention by the EU Council, all the signs of unity. I am intrigued by your choices of examples. There is no unity on energy policy. I am sure that your Prime Minister would agree with me. You are probably too polite to do so here. But the Poles, the Slovaks are not happy with the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, just spending like an insane amount of money to support German companies and German individuals with the rising energy costs. And he did so without consulting his European partners. He did so without EU involvement. Talk about level playing field, right? Which is the obsession of the EU. And that is why it seeks to start a trade war against the United States of all the partners, right? Which they badly need for energy supplies and for security. The other amusing example from my perspective is to praise the Eurozone as the sign of stability, and the fact that Croatia is joining it, in your view, shows what a marvelous product it is. For me, and I discuss it extensively in the book, the euro is a perfect example of EU's dysfunction. The euro is a currency in search of a state, because the EU, again, is not a state. It doesn't have fiscal policies. It is meant to have independent monetary policies, which are no longer independent because the ECB has to basically run the Eurozone. And the idea that the Eurozone crisis is over is completely foolhardy, because, of course, the energy crisis that is very real and will impact major economies of Europe, including Germany, in ways that still people struggle to imagine. This will bring Eurozone crisis back. And the dysfunction within the Eurozone has not been addressed, could not have been addressed, and we don't talk about it much because, of course, the war is way more important and more serious right now. But all the crises that I discuss in my book, migration crisis, the Eurozone crisis, are coming back with a vengeance. They are overshadowed by the war in Ukraine, but they are not therefore made easier to manage. Quite the opposite. So what I argue is a more focused Europe, a more realistic Europe, if you want, Europe that does do less but better.
Let me see if anybody here in the audience has a question. Yes, I saw you. Just wait for the mic.
Yeah, I mean, if Europe can't get together to sort out the COVID crisis, how can they be expected to sort out the invasion of Ukraine? And the other point is I've got is, who blew up the gas pipelines? And is this a cunning plan for Europe to unite?
Thomas, do you want to, did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard that. And now on the who blew up the gas pipelines, I'm afraid I can't give you a reply on that one. But yeah, a lot has been raised, and I think we should be clear about a few things, and that no one is saying that the European Union, which I often try and clarify that the European Union is are we talking about European institutions or the European Union as a whole, which is the European Union, the institutions plus its member states, because often the discussions get a little blurred because of that distinction. And so no one is saying that the setup is perfect by all means. And I refer to the unanimity principle before. This is, you can argue that this is holding back Europe's ability to act in the area of foreign policy in many ways, and also the fact that the common foreign and security policy is and the stronger role given to the European Union within that is a relatively recent phenomenon. So I think, as I said, in terms of the energy policy, this is to a large degree work in progress. So yes, there are disagreements. There always will be. But mentioned an emergency regulation that's coming into force of critical issues in relation to the energy crisis. And this is being done at EU level with agreement by all member states. And we've seen already, to a certain extent, enough to developments. So I think more focus should be put up. And the EU should be doing less. I think that is also recognized. The professor will be familiar with the subsidiarity principle. This is being strengthened. For those who are not familiar with this principle, that is to do things at the lowest level of governance possible. So you only act at European level when this is found to be in the interest of all member states. And this is a principle that has been reinforced over time. But when it comes to things like climate change, when it comes to things like trade policy, the European Union has to act at the level of Europe has to act at the level of European Union. That's why we are a strong negotiating partner within the WTO, because we can present a market of 450 million as a single market. Not to speak of climate change and the weight that the European Union has in climate change negotiations. So this has to be clear, and it's also derives from the issue of shared sovereignty. We can only act in this way if member states are willing, in certain areas, not all areas, but in certain areas, to this principle of shared sovereignty. This is why the European Union works, and why it is different from other international organizations which do not have this principle of shared sovereignty. This is the fundamental difference. Then when it comes to COVID, I would tend to disagree. Yes, it's been a catastrophe, and Europe had a slow start, but in the end, Europe got its act together. And I think no one is now denying the fact that there was joint procurement of vaccines. This really helped Europe come through the crisis, and so we were acting at again at European level in an area which is new. The European Union, this should be stressed, the European Union never had competence in the area of health, and suddenly, because of this crisis, was asked to come in and intervene in the area of public health. So this should also be underlined when it comes to talking about do countries feel that they can achieve more if they come together? And I think COVID is an example of that as well.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We're coming near the end of our time.
I just wanted to answer one sentence to what you
please
said.
go ahead.
I'm very sorry, but we're not only member as Germany of the European Union, but we're also a member of a military alliance. and that is responsible for our security. So I do not understand why you say that European Union will not be able to deliver security to its member states, because it is also done and primarily done via NATO. And very sorry for that, Mr. Borrell is not my boss.
Okay.
So no problem with that.
I'm
No,
relieved
but
for you.
perhaps,
Hold on, and Alexander, you had a point as
Yeah, I'd
well.
also would like to comment as I was called to the board a couple of times in the previous statement. So when the conversation to compromise the Habermas ideal, I do agree that it does not work for the military engagement in the times of kinetic crisis, so to speak. So it does not work in Ukraine, but this is not what the EU has been constructed for. Yes, exactly what Stefan has been just saying. Yes, for that we have got NATO, we have got other military alliances, and that is exactly why there are two pillars of Polish foreign policy from the very beginning of our reclaimed sovereignty after 1989. And that is number one, being a member of the European Union. Number two, being a member of the NATO. Those two things are complementary. They are not mutually exclusive. And as far as our vision for the EU is concerned, it is the EU as defined by the treaties. So the confederation of sovereign states, not some superpower imposing its will, is the confederation of sovereign states, strong in unity, strong in diversity as well. So we are for the strong EU and strong Poland within the structure of the strong EU, and we do not see those two objectives either as mutually exclusive.
Okay, can we get one final quick question here, very quick?
Could I just one sentence?
Yes, go ahead.
Because I think what you have seen now is interesting, but subtly expressed differences, because the EU ambassador talked about the EU as a post-sovereign entity of sorts where sovereignty is shared, while Polish ambassador represents the view that's closer actually to my vision.
In all areas.
If you don't mind, I'll finish the sentence. If you don't mind, I'll just finish the sentence.
Hold on, one at a time.
That is closer to my vision, that it is a collection of sovereign states, and that is because sovereignty cannot be shared, particularly in times of crisis, right? Who is the one who decides on the exception is the sovereign one, and it is the nation state, as it happened in response to Ukraine, for example, or in the early stages of the corona crisis. So sovereignty is like pregnancy. You can't be half pregnant. You are either pregnant or not.
Last question there, quick one.
Yeah, for the whole talk by the gentleman, until the last minute, the word of NATO was never mentioned. Only until last minute, Stefan was saying that. So my question is that, is NATO a taboo subject that you cannot talk about? Because you can see whether the agenda set by NATO will cause disunity among the EU, because not 27 countries are part of NATO. And so the question is that, Stefan, what do you see about the disunity that caused by NATO? And is there an end to it, or is it going to be driving away from this member?
Stefan.
The question is excellent. I'm immensely grateful for it, because that is the point I wanted to address. I am all in favor of NATO, as most people are in Central Europe. But German government talks a lot about the EU, and that the support for Ukraine has to be coordinated with the EU. Germany is an excellent example of a member state disempowering itself through the EU, hiding behind the EU, hiding its limited willingness to help Ukraine by talking about the need for European unity. But mind you, when I tell you that NATO is not the only point of reference, you need to consider the French government and its vision for a sovereign Europe that is in open competition with NATO, right? This is not what Germany wants. It's certainly not what Poland would allow for. But I am not just imagining that as an issue, right? That Europe wants to be also a military player. Your not boss Borrell talks about it incessantly, and President Macron talks about a strategic Europe, a sovereign Europe, a Europe that can live without the US support. And there are credible arguments in support of that point of view. When you look at the US that is internally divided, we could have had a session about the disunion of the United States, right? How much longer will Europeans be able to depend on the US support, particularly when they also feel confident enough to start a trade war against Biden's administration of all the administrations to imagine.
Just because you know,
I'll give you a last word.
Because you said for the third time that the European Union started a trade war, doesn't make it a correct argument. I just can't always contradict each of your sentences. So I don't agree with that, just to mention that. And to your question, once again about unity in Europe, well, as a matter of fact, 2 EU member states who in the past have not been members of NATO have now applied for NATO membership. So perhaps this is also a step more in this direction of EU unity and also, well, support for this military alliance.
I don't think we're going to find unity on this panel here, so I think it's about time to get you back to your offices. Sorry, we went a little bit over. I think it was such a great discussion. Thomas, sorry you weren't not here in the room, but thank you for joining us in the Zoom, and hope you get back here soon. And in the room here, thank you, Consul General Alexander Danda. Thank you, Deputy Consul General Stefan Brittle, and then thank you, author and Professor Stefan Auer, for bringing some controversial ideas to the table. Thomas, when you come, we have a gift for you, but for those in the room, you get a gift. And by the way, it's accidentally that it's EU colors. EU colors are also FCC colors, by the way. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Really hope you enjoyed that stimulating conversation, and we'll see you all at the next event. If they want to just get a quick picture here, then we can get out.
No problem.